In the fall of 1993, a young 3-year-old Togolese girl named Farida Nabourema had a bright future. She was too young to realize it, but thanks to her industrious, frugal parents, she would have the means to pursue a meaningful education and career. But when Farida's family woke up on the morning of January 12, 1994, everything had changed. Overnight, her parents lost half of their savings, not due to theft, bank robbery, or company bankruptcy, but a currency devaluation imposed by a foreign power more than 4,500 kilometers away. The previous evening, French officials and IMF bureaucrats met in Dakar to discuss the fate of the CFA franc. For years, the currency used by citizens of Togo and other West and Central African nations had been pegged to the French franc at a rate of 1 to 50. But when the late-night meeting concluded, it was 1 to 100. The economic fates of tens of millions of people had been decided by French leaders, with the complicity of pro-French rulers of countries such as Togo and Ivory Coast. This is French monetary colonialism, an exploitative system of monetary control which has outlasted political colonialism and allowed France to retain control over the economies of 15 African countries and subsidize the French way of life. Despite decades of uprisings, the system stands to this day, but is now being challenged by a new form of resistance: open source code. At the height of its imperialism, the French colonial empire stretched over 11.5 million square kilometers. After World War II, the French had fought tooth and nail to keep their colonial possessions, but eventually were forced to give them up. However, the benefits of the resources and labor of French colonies in West and Central Africa were too rich. Paris devised a scheme to have its cake and eat it too, ending political colonialism while orchestrating monetary colonialism. This was the birth of the CFA franc. The French understand that by controlling the colonial franc currency, also known as the CFA franc, it increases its power against its former colonies and allows it to siphon the wealth back to Paris in numerous ways. The CFA franc was originally introduced in 1945. By the 1990s, it had been devalued by 99.5%. The CFA farmers and producers have no recourse. France still manufactures all of the notes and coins used in the CFA regions, charging 45 million euros per year for the service. And if CFA residents want to travel abroad, they're forced to convert their colonial francs to euros, as the CFA currency is worthless outside their countries. France again takes its cut. With the guise of generosity, France grants loans to its CFA nations for infrastructure developments, but the work is contracted to French companies. This is the infamous double loan. The taxpayers of countries like Ivory Coast are on the hook for the entire loan plus interest, while the French get paid back twice. First, in an immediate sense, when the loan is used to pay a French company to complete a project, and then later, when the principal plus interest is paid back on the loan. By denying CFA nations the ability to produce their own manufacturing-based economies, and by steering CFA nations away from consumption agriculture and towards producing inedible exports designed for world markets, they eliminate sovereignty and engineer dependence. Today, the CFA system has been Africanized. Togo's currency now shows local culture and flora and fauna, but these are only superficial changes. The banknotes are still made in Paris. French officials still sit on the boards of 2 of the 3 regional CFA banks, and the wealth generated by the French authorities in the first 7 decades of the CFA system, when Paris got to keep national reserves and dictate monetary policy, has not been returned. The World Bank and IMF work in concert with France to enforce the CFA system, and rarely, if ever, criticize its exploitative nature. The IMF managing director position has often been held by a French official. Recently, Christine Lagarde. Contradicting the values of liberté, égalité, fraternité.
Ladies and gentlemen, Farida Nabourema.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry, I didn't want to start the morning with a very emotionally charged video, but here we are. I'm Farida Nabourema. I'm a political activist from Togo, has been involved in the liberation movement for my country for more than a decade. And I'm here today to talk about the subject that you have been introduced to through the video called the CFA franc. My country, Togo, was a French colony, and like several other African countries that were French colonies, we are facing a specific form of colonization that we describe as monetary colonialism. One will wonder how come so many countries, after 60 years of independence, are still struggling to obtain economic growth. The reality of the vast majority of those CFA countries is that they are among the poorest nations on this planet. The journey for the struggle of liberation of Togo literally started with the CFA. I would like to walk you through history because the political context is very important for you to understand what I am trying to establish, especially the connection between our struggle and Bitcoin. So back in the colonial era in our countries, it was illegal for citizens from our nation to own any other currency but the French franc at the time, which was imposed on the nation. The independence movement leaders of Togo eventually got arrested, specifically our first president, Sylvanus Olympio, because he used to work for a British company at the time and used to be paid in British pound, and he issued a check in British pounds, which led him to being arrested, deprived from his civic rights, and jailed for 2 years. Eventually, he walked the movement to the front and became the first president of Togo. 2 years later, he wanted to put an end to the CFA system, which was imposed on Togo and many other French nations French colonies following independence. The CFA currency was initially called le franc des colonies françaises d'Afrique, which means the francs of the French colonies in Africa. It was modeled on the Nazi monetary system imposed in France during occupation during World War II. At the end of World War II in 1946, France needed money, gold, to be able to have some political acumen internationally, especially to be relevant within the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. So France came up with this beautiful idea that the Nazi, beautiful quote unquote, that the Nazi imposed on its own government during occupation, which was to have all the gold reserves of every single of its colonies in Africa put in the Bank of France. In addition to that, it detained complete control over our monetary policies, when we print money, how much we print money, and it determines the value of that currency. Well, when we got our independence, the French government imposed what was called the Pacte Colonial, and the Pacte Colonial required us to keep the CFA as a currency, keep our gold in the Bank of France, and most importantly, it provided the French companies the first right of refusal over our natural resources. This meant that the gold exploited in Mali, Burkina Faso, had to be bought uniquely by French companies, the phosphate in Togo, the oil in Gabon, Congo, Chad, the bauxite in Guinea, and many others. In the end, it means French companies were able to purchase our natural resources at absolutely little to nothing. They paid very little for it, and there was no accountability in the process. The most difficult part is that today, when you look at France, it is a nuclear power in the world. 3 bulbs out of 4 in France are lighted by nuclear power, which was produced thanks to the uranium extracted in Niger. And Niger happens to be, interestingly, the poorest nation on the planet, with only 17% of its population having access to electricity. Of course, not all African leaders and citizens sat comfortable with this pact because for them, it was a continuation of colonialism. The first president of Togo, Sylvanus Olympio, was the first one to challenge the CFA currency. He introduced a bill at the Togolese parliament in December 1962, which was voted unanimously by our first parliament. Exactly 1 month later, after introducing that bill and having it passed to establish the creation of the Togolese franc, soldiers of the French colonial army went to his house and assassinated him. This guy became the president of Togo and ruled the country for 38 years. When he died, his son, Fonya Singbe, also took over in a coup and has been president of Togo ever since. My country is ruled by the oldest autocracy in Africa. The same family has combined 57 years in power. And what does that mean for us, the people of Togo? It means living in the worst form of dictatorship ever. We woke up under the rule of Edemanya Singbe, being forced to clap for the president every morning when he's going to work and every evening when he returns from work. We live in a country where there was no such thing as freedom of speech or association. Every single attempt to challenge the system was crushed very severely. My family members and many others spent years in prison simply because they made a critique against this regime. But when Eyadema died, the then president of France, Jacques Chirac, mentioned that he lost a personal friend, and a great ally of France. For us, the people of Togo fighting for freedom and democracy, it was painful to witness such a dictator being celebrated and supported globally. But then our struggle didn't stop there. We continued fighting for justice and freedom in Togo. And eventually, we got to a point where we managed to get thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets demanding an end to the system. Of course, our protests once again were met with violence, forcing thousands to exile like myself, sending hundreds to prison, and many of our comrades are still languishing in prison. Now, I need to establish the connection between our struggle and Bitcoin. In our process for democracy, as human rights activists and citizens, we have faced the worst form of persecution, but the most pervasive one has been the financial persecution of our people. The Togolese people as a nation, for example, have one of the largest diaspora in the world because millions of our citizens fled the country due to political persecution. So our struggle relied heavily on diaspora remittances. But there came a time where the government managed to track every person who sends money to the movement and send them to prison. We still have Togolese people in prison today simply because they donated as little as $50 to our movement. They've been in prison for more than 5 years with no trial and have been tortured to the point where many have lost their ability to walk. So at some point, it was apparent for us that we have to find a different way for us to be able to send and receive money to continue our struggle. Then Bitcoin became a tool. In that moment, it was a tool we discovered to be able to bypass government surveillance and bypass government censorship because the bank accounts of activists were frozen, and sometimes they wait for you to go to a Western Union to cash money to arrest you because they can track you there. But then eventually, we got to understand as well that Bitcoin not only was a tool, but was a philosophy of liberation. The whole idea that our struggle came from the fact that we, the people of Togo and many other Francophone countries in Africa, just wanted the right to print our own money, to decide on our monetary policies, became possible through Bitcoin, because now as citizens, we don't have to rely on a currency that was created specifically to exploit us. A currency that has lost more than 200% of its value since its creation, which literally meant that our conditions of life have depreciated over the ages since the colonial era. The people of Togo today and many other of those countries are worse off today than they were during the colonial era. Why? Because they work so hard, but they are paid in a monkey currency. So thanks to the CFA revolution, we have been trying to get Bitcoin into the hands of the people in different communities, including the rural areas, but most importantly, investing in education for our citizens to understand that we don't have to wait necessarily for another decade or 2 or 3 or 5 to be able to overcome tyrants that are emboldened, empowered, and reinforced by one of the world's most powerful nations on the planet. But we can just dive into Bitcoin and start finding alternatives and not having to continue paying colonial taxes to the French government. I would like to talk about this lady here. Her name is Nathalie Yam. She has been one of the bravest people fighting for freedom and for the CFA abolition in Africa. She is actually a Swiss citizen and also a citizen of Cameroon, one of the CFA countries. Well, she has been banned to enter France. All of her bank accounts have been frozen simply because she has been extremely vocal against the CFA system and against French monetary colonialism. The reality of Nathalie Yam is the same with many other activists like myself that are are demanding accountability, but are also pushing for change and demanding that citizens globally adopt Bitcoin, because we believe that Bitcoin, unlike the CFA, was not designed specifically to exploit us. It is the currency of humanity. For us, having the Bitcoin means that the value it holds when we are in Togo, in Cameroon, in Senegal, in Mali, has the same value as whoever holds it in Britain, in France, in Belgium, or in the United States. And that equality is what matters the most to us. So I'd like to thank you so much for welcoming me today. Have enjoyed the rest of the day.